In Control, you never know you've countered the wrong thing until you've lost the game.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things cEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I am your host, Ryan.
And I'm your host, Callahan. And today we're going to be talking about playing Control in cEDH. You know, what makes a cEDH list a Control deck? What does it look like to build a Control deck? How much do you have to worry about control card advantage when you're playing Control?
Yep, and we're going to get into all of that, but before we go any further, we want to talk quickly about our sponsors. That is TCG Player, Dragon Shield, and support from viewers like you and listeners like you over on Patreon. When you purchase your cards and accessories, be sure to buy them from tcgplayer.com. So they give some of the best prices on the internet, and you get to support local game stores in the process, which we absolutely love. When you receive that product, make sure you protect it with Dragon Shield accessories. They are the best in the business when it comes to quality. Playing with Power has been using them for years to protect our things. Finally, and all this content comes from support from viewers like you over on Patreon. So we have all kinds of benefits for our patrons, including Patreon meetup days, which we just had, Discord access, entry into our webcam tournaments and our webcam leagues, and just a whole bunch of others. And you can find all that over on our Patreon page. So the links for all of these are in the description below, so consider supporting us today.
And, you know, every episode, as a special thanks, we give a shout out to a very lucky patron. And this episode, it is going to be Sean Buss. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Sean. We really appreciate it. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic, and that is Control in cEDH. So let's go ahead and just start from the top. So take it away, Callahan. So what makes a cEDH deck a Control deck, if you will?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously, when we talk about cEDH, we're always talking about the archetype of different decks. You know, this is a proactive list. This is a control list. And I think of all the different archetypes, what is a control list might be one of the hardest things to define because, you know, we're playing cEDH. If we don't want Mr. Turbo Nos to win over there on turn 2, we all have to have some kind of controlling elements in our deck. However, I find that Control in cEDH almost seems to be more about play philosophy, a little bit about your card choices. The majority of your deck, rather than focusing on immediately comboing off, is going to be focused more on one-for-one controlling the board. You know, countering your spell, removing your value piece, and then, you know, on your turn, you probably play a rock, pass the turn. You're not trying to win at any cost, as soon as possible.
That's interesting because there's a lot of people who would say that, you know, everyone has an element of control in their decks. So this would be things like, you know, having a Chain of Vapor or, you know, having Mana Drain in their decks. And where exactly, when it comes to control, do you see those lines like start to actually shift away from that into more of a, this is a control deck? Like, what point do you actually say to yourself, this isn't proactive, this isn't adaptive, this is control? Like, is there a certain metric you use? Is there something more specific you use? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
I think it's certainly hard to find a hard metric or any of that kind of stuff, hard lines. But, you know, if you're maybe thinking about putting Wavebreak Hippocamp into your deck, you know, if you're looking at Teferi, Master of Time, if you are maybe looking to, if you're thinking, you know, I think Spell Snare actually looks really great in my list, then you're probably looking a lot more at a control deck than maybe something that's more proactive.
So would you attribute it to just something like the cards in your deck, or would you consider it something more like a philosophical approach, somewhere in between?
I would certainly consider it more of a philosophical approach because, you know, if you are not going into the game aiming to control what everyone else is doing, you'd never think about playing Wavebreak Hippocamp in the first place. You know, sure. if you're making the philosophical choice to say, I would like to take action on everyone else's turn to deal with their game plans so later I can advance my own, then you're probably doing a bit more of a controlling thing than a proactive thing.
So why would you choose something like control over something like proactive or adaptive, for example?
I think, like many other things in cEDH, it very well could just be that you enjoy that kind of play style. I know myself, people who know me know that I play Rashmi Control and have pretty much ever since Rashmi was released back in Kaladesh in 2017, 2018. And obviously, Rashmi Control isn't exactly the best deck anymore, but that controlling play style, policing the board, making sure that everyone stays above board and you get to put yourself in the position to win late. Someone might just enjoy that kind of play style. I think there are certainly, when you get more into the tournament side of things, maybe you're always being a little more spiky about cEDH. You could potentially choose to play control going well into a certain meta. Like I think versus a lot of stacks decks, which are becoming more and more popular, I personally think control can match up really well against heavy stacks decks because they're almost kind of doing your job for you. And then a lot of times you can probably just untap, remove their stacks piece, and win.
What challenges would you say that maybe control has, or differences that you would say that control has over other decks?
I think the challenges of control are great in many, I think, in comparison to many other archetypes in cEDH, because especially depending on the pod composition, if you are a control deck and you sit down with three, people who are trying to win very quickly, you sit down to a Krom Tevesh list, maybe a 5-color, a Sisay list, and a...
Godo?
Yeah, sure. Say Godo, Ryan.
It's always going to be what I say. So that's just the way it goes.
But hey, Godo really threatening to win on turn 2 or 3 without interaction, right? Mm-hmm. So if you sit down to a pot of one of those 3 things, you're going to be in for a very bad time because no matter what you do, you are not going to have the resources to slow down those decks. And one of them will overwhelm you and win the game before you can have a chance.
That's very interesting that you said that because you almost make it sound like it's an uphill battle to play control in cEDH. So would you say that that's the case, or is that maybe a misnomer when it comes to cEDH control lists? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would certainly say that it is. And I think this pretty naturally flows into the next thing that I was wanting to talk about, which is, the way that card advantage works in cEDH. 1v1, historically, control has been a pretty strong archetype throughout the history of one-on-one competitive Magic because your opponent does a thing, you can answer their thing. Your opponent does a thing, you can answer the thing, and it goes on like that. In card advantage terms, you are trading one card that they spent resources on, hopefully a lot, for less of your resources, like, 2 mana for their 5 mana, and you both went down a card, right? Where in cEDH, how card advantage works is almost entirely different. Every time you try to 1-for-1 answer an opponent, yes, you are putting yourself down a card, and you are putting one of your opponents down a card. But however, you have put yourself so much farther behind than you would normally because you have put 2 of your opponents ahead of you and another opponent by 1 card each, effectively. So that's a very, very, very hard battle to fight because card advantage is one of the major cornerstones of everything to do with how Magic the Gathering operates.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's so much that we can dive into when it comes to card advantage in cEDH. I definitely want to go deeper on this. Mm-hmm. So, obviously, I agree. Like in a 1v1 format, control is very, straightforward and easy to understand. But when you start talking about how you're giving other people advantage by simply trying to control another player, that's where you start to lose a few people in the, the 4-player free-for-all formats. So what you're talking about is that just because when I'm player 1 and I counter player 2's spell that he was trying to use to either win the game or accrue a resource that could, eventually win the game, you are creating disadvantage for yourself, not by trading 1-for-1, but by the fact that players 3 and 4 that are also at the table didn't have to do anything. Mm-hmm. So their inaction created advantage through your action.
That is
Would you
correct.
say that that's correct? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that is certainly correct. And in addition to all of that, you put yourself behind because you don't necessarily have to mental misstep that person's gamble, right? Because you don't know that they were necessarily going to be winning with that gamble when the person next to them could untap and vampiric tutor and then win the game from there. But
And when you're talking about card advantage, how do you? A lot of times people think that card advantage is just like, oh, more cards in my hand. But there's so many extra dimensions to card advantage. You have things like virtual advantage, you have things like inverse advantage, you have things like card velocity, and just straight card advantage where you're just drawing cards. Most people think about it in that last metric. Card advantage is drawing cards. I'm going to play Blue Sun Zenith and draw 7 cards. That's what a lot of people think of in EDH, casual, and even starting to go into the realms of things like cEDH, where they still think about a metric of, well, if I draw more cards, I'm going to get more advantage. But you're saying that, when you're playing control, that's actually a losing battle, or is it, what is that from an aspect purely of control?
Yeah, so, obviously that's a really big disadvantage. And obviously card advantage isn't only just raw, I draw 7 cards off of Blue Sun Zenith. There's a lot of other ways that you can get around the problem. But honestly, when it comes to control, that kind of raw card advantage is almost one of the strongest things you can go for. In so many proactive decks, because they're a proactive deck, they've got a lot of different things going on. Maybe they've got this combo piece. Oh no, I've got the 2 wrong combo pieces in my hand. Drawing a ton of cards might not automatically fix that problem. In your combo deck, such a huge amount of your list is high quality interaction and more pure card advantage. So that if you're just, R casting on the end of, you're player 4, on the end of player 3's turn, you cast Blue Sun Zenith for 6, you're probably drawing 3, 4, 5 cards of straight gas that will help you refill your hand and be ready to go for the next turn cycle. So you were saying that in some ways, control almost cares more about raw card advantage than a lot of the other kinds of card advantage, just almost by the way that their decks are built in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So what you're actually telling me is that raw card advantage is very important in a control list. So you will actually dedicate real resources to making sure that for lack of a better word, your hand is full in order to be able to play that proper role at the table. Would you say that that's correct?
Oh yeah, I would say that is certainly the case. That's why when you look at control decks, that's why you do see random cards. Like, I keep coming back to it, but it's one of the newer control staples, Wave Break Hippocamp, right? When you cast a spell on an opponent's turn, you draw a card. That's just great. It turns every single one of your interactive spells into a cantrip. That almost automatically fixes your raw card advantage problem. Obviously, it doesn't fix the problem of your opponents being accelerated a tiny little bit, but that automatically fixes the raw card advantage problem. That's why these days, a lot of the time, you'll only see control lists running cards like Dig Through Time, because Dig Through Time, it is one card that usually for very cheap gives you a great selection of picking up 2 cards, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. The reason that I say that is because when you look at something like Wave Break Hippocamp, so a typical proactive player will not look at that card and say that it's very good. But through a control mindset or frame of mind, you're actually saying to yourself, I'm actually helping to negate my card disadvantage because I'm not looking to spend my resources on my turn. I'm looking to spend them on yours.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I can gladly take my turn to develop a Wave Break Hippocamp because that greatly enables the power of my ability to interact on other people's turns.
Yeah. So basically what you're looking to do is that you're trying to find these engines, if you will, these value engines that allow you to keep making sure that you're not going down in the resources that would normally choke out a control player in a 4-player format. So I would say things like the new Archmage Emeritus would be a good one. So every time you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, you draw a card from it. I would say that's a good engine. You mentioned Wave Break Hippocamp. You also talked about, obviously the namesake Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter, is a really good one. Another one that you see a lot of times in control lists and common cEDH pods is your Thrasios Vial Smasher builds. And the reason that they do this is because they call it Curious Control, because they use a curiosity effect on Vial Smasher. So every time you cast a spell during your first one during a turn, Vial Smasher triggers, but that curiosity effect allows you to put another card into your hand. So I think that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I've always been more of a fan of the term 4-color Rashmi myself. Build your own Rashmi by putting curiosity onto Vial Smasher for the exact same effect. Yep. Yeah, this transitions almost perfectly into what it looks like when you're trying to build a cEDH control list. Obviously you start out with the same huge piles of, the greatest counter spells of all time, Pact of Negation, Force of Will, at this point, often Force of Negation, so on and so forth. A lot of control decks play counterspell when a lot of other decks never would, and you got to find a lot of those engines, and more and more and more. A lot of times you'll be finding these control decks find their engine in the command zone, because obviously that makes the most sense. That's a card you always have access to, and so that's why so often when you see a control deck, the commander will say right on its face, give me raw card advantage. Whether that be Rashmi, obviously, one of the original draw go control decks in the more modern format. Cast a spell on someone else's turn. Boom. You can either cast this spell for free or you get to put it in your hand. Tasigur, obviously. Tasigur gives you card advantage from your graveyard all day long. Nimrus, kind of a newer control commander that people are going for, very similar to Rashmi and Tasigur in ways. Cast spells, look at the top few, pick one, the other one goes in your graveyard. All of these, and like you said as well, Thrasios and Vial Smasher. Thrasios obviously itself is a bit of a card advantage engine, albeit a bit expensive. And Vial Smasher with a curiosity effect, it's just Rashmi all over again. Mm-hmm. So obviously that's a lot of place where you can find these engines. And from there, you just have to make other informed card decisions that can help you execute your game plan. Obviously, I've already mentioned Dig Through Time is great at finding specific cards, putting you on card advantage. Baral, Chief of Compliance, another, thankfully, not a commander you see much more anymore. But by discounting your spells, keeps you up on mana, and by filtering whenever you counter, helps you keep up great card quality in your hand. These are the kind of cards that you'll see people instantly turn to when they're maybe trying to build a controlled list.
So what kind of density would you say that you need to find a balance of when you're talking about building a cEDH control list? So, what level of interaction do you put in? What level of advantage engines do you put in? Yeah. What do some of the typical closers look like in a control list? Is that something... talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so... Actually, this is a very interesting time to be discussing this topic, because I think the landscape in cEDH controlled deck building has really been torn asunder by Hull Breacher banning. Both because they're, control decks out of so many decks where it'd be advantaged by being able to go Hull Breacher, Time Twister, you can't play the game anymore. I have infinite resources to play around with. Or, on the other hand, Hull Breacher was really good at shutting down some of these advantage engines we were talking about, specifically Wavebreak, Hippocamp, and Archmage Emeritus. I've never played Archmage Emeritus until recently because I don't want to invest 4 mana into this resource and immediately turn it into something that automatically feeds someone else's Hull Breacher. But to answer your question more directly, I think... a lot of these decks, you often end up with around 40 instants, which is kind of insane. That is a huge portion of your deck, considering that, you're probably running 28, 29, 30 lands, right?
That's a big number. Yeah.
That is a humongous number, and it's because, you're running a lot of cantrips, so you can trigger your cast to draw spells effects. You're running a lot of instants in sorcery tutors, as opposed to some of the other more traditional tutors. You're running massive piles and piles and piles of counterspells. Like, what other kind of cEDH deck is going to run Dispel, right?
A lot. Yeah. What are you talking about, control player?
Look, okay, I picked a random counterspell out of my head that was slightly more niche than Mana Drain, okay?
Funny, yeah.
But how many decks are playing Beast Within anymore? How many decks are playing Muddle the Mixture unless they're really trying to find an Isochron Scepter? It's this massive pile, and a lot of that you sacrifice combo pieces. So many of these combo decks often will really only have one win con. Very, very often it is good old ISO Rev doing something cute like milling people out with Blue Sun Zenith. It's pretty common. Niv Mizzet Control, though it's not as popular, obviously your win con right there is just slap a curiosity effect on Niv Mizzet and you've won the game. So on and so forth. But so often they have to have these very, very, very tight win packages that can also do other things in the game, because when you're relying on raw card advantage, you don't want to draw a combo piece at the wrong time. Sounds weird to say, but in Control, it's very often the case.
And I could absolutely see that, because you could actually say that in just about any deck. Like, if I'm playing Godo, which is the example I'll use on every podcast episode, no matter what. So I will hate drawing my Helm of the Host, because I can actually find better ways to get it out a lot easier. Versus just casting my commander.
Like casting Godo, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Like casting the commander to win. But like, if I'm doing something like that, I have to kind of pivot my strategy, and I don't really want to have Helm of the Host in hand. Yes, we have ways to get around that and stuff, but it's not a card that I want to see. I'm not looking to draw my combo piece. Now, other decks, sometimes they do want to draw it, but sometimes they want to find a different way to get it. Like Razakats. Razakats, yeah, if you can find a way to get it into your graveyard from your hand, that's great. But you don't want to just sit with an 8-drop Razaket the Foul-Blooded in your hand with no way to put it in your graveyard. So it's essentially just a dead card in your hand until you find the way to effectively put it in there. So I can see where, the more compact your win conditions are, the lower density the lower chances you have of actually drawing them. Yeah,
like for an example here, and I'm just gonna, it's obviously not the most relevant thing anymore, but it's the deck that I've been playing for 3-4 years, right? In Rashmi Control, you never, ever, ever, ever want to see Dramatic Reversal unless that's the thing. It is the only card in the deck that you pretty much never want to see at any one point in time. Every other card in the list is either there to control your opponents or like gain you more value. So like, you're never going to be sad if you rip an Opt off the top, because that can be 2 more cards. You're never going to be sad if you rip Isochron Scepter off the top, because you can imprint a counterspell on that sucker or a mystical tutor on that sucker, bounce it back to your hand when you need to recycle it, right? And that kind of thing. You're never going to be sad if you draw Seasons Past, even though it's technically a part of your combo win lines often. I will cast it for massive value. It'll put my shields down a little bit, but then it just goes safely back onto the bottom of my library, should it resolve. And then I just go back along on my merry way, where it seems more and more often that a lot of these proactive decks, once they get past turn 4, 5, or 6, there's so many more scenarios where they can just rip completely dead cards off the top of their library. And control decks so often are hopefully built well to mitigate that effect.
So I talk here and there about card quality. And a lot of times in a previous episode, I was talking with Ian from Comedian MTG, and we were talking about ad nauseum. And one of the things that we talked about in that episode was talking about how ad nauseum strategies will sacrifice quality for speed. So when you get a really, really good, fast, being able to power out something like an ad nauseum on turn 2, you have to sacrifice a little bit of card quality to do it. And it so real feels bad when you're in the late game because you've been disrupted once, maybe twice, and you're trying to get out from under this boot that's on you, and you're ripping these dead cards off the top of your library because they're part of a 2, 3, 4 card combo, or they're just not getting you to where you need to be anymore because the card quality is so low because everything was engineered towards going fast. And what you're saying is that the card quality in control lists needs to be a much higher step than something like that.
Yeah, for sure, certainly. Especially when you get to the 3 and 4 color control lists. Every single card in that list, you are almost never going to be sad to see it off the top, unless it's a land when you already have 10 of them.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, but that's universal truth, right? Because every single card is there for the explicit purpose of controlling your opponents, which, especially in cEDH, is almost never going to be out of style. Your opponents can always try to pull one over on you, no matter what point of the game it is. That ad nos player, after you stop them on turn 3, oh, look, they drew demonic consultation. What do you do now?
Yep.
And that kind of thing. So, yeah, every single... except for in Rashmi, we only have 2 colors there, but that's besides the point. The card quality in so many of these control lists has to be monumentally high because you always have to be on your toes. And since your card quality is so high, that does push back the turn when you're going to win because you're not as focused on winning immediately so often.
So... obviously, we talked about, compact win conditions. We talked about density of interaction. You said, 40 being kind of an average number, which is a really crazy thought when you think about it.
It is insanely high. We didn't even talk about how many sorceries are in these things.
Yeah, exactly. So you're just packing it full of all of this control, and, you have all of these different things, and you have really compact win conditions. But, talk about the command zone now. Like what kind of commanders, the 98 and the 99 and the 100 in your deck, what kind of commanders lend themselves better to a control strategy versus, let's say, some others that are more proactive?
Yeah. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but so often it is really just going to be number one. The colors certainly matter. To this day, that is the greatest downfall of my first love, Rashmi. Green and blue alone, not so great anymore with how awesome black, white, and red are in cEDH anymore. Yeah. Tasigur, in addition to being such a raw card advantage engine in the command zone, gives you access to so many tools just by the addition of black. So much more so in 4-color control. Thrasios, a little bit of a card advantage engine. Vial Smasher with the right setup, an incredible card advantage engine, and those 4 colors give you access to almost every single thing you could want under the sun that isn't a rule of law effect. So when you're looking for commanders, the colors have got to be right, and certainly being able to give you some kind of card advantage solution from the command zone is so often what is important. Especially going to the colors thing, I bet if Niv Mizzet was a blue-black card, then we would all be terrified of Niv Mizzet decks at every single point in our cEDH playing life. But instead, since Niv Mizzet is just blue-red, it has to sacrifice so much card quality that it could gain just by the addition of another color. Because blue and red, as a color combo, you're missing out on so much there for control potential.
So it's not just something like raw card advantage. It's also, the colors. The colors are just as important when you're picking a commander for a control list. For sure. All right, so let's put ourselves into the driver's seat. We talked about, control in an abstract. We talked about, control as a DAC. Now let's actually talk about control as a pilot. What are some tips and advice and tricks that you would give on actually piloting control DACs?
Yeah, so I think there's almost an overarching, a few different segments here that you certainly have to think about when you're playing control. Some of them you have to think about when you're playing other cEDH decks. Like some of it is certainly general cEDH knowledge turned up to 11. And, well, it's all just cEDH knowledge turned up to an 11. I think one of the most important things you can do, number one, when you sit down to pilot cEDH, if you can sit down and look at your opponent's commanders and instantaneously guess what they're going to be doing, you sit down and you say, I know Ishai Jessica is really just trying to kill me on turn 3 with a big flying bird. If I draw my rapid hybridization, if I have a rapid hybridization in my first 7, they aren't going to be able to do anything to me. If you are able to have that knowledge up in your head, then your threat assessment will instantaneously bring you to the next level compared to what it would be if you're facing off against someone's deck that you don't even recognize.
How do you determine that? Is there just a number of trial and error with that? What would be some tips that you give someone who's new to Control on how to kind of get acclimated to something like that?
Obviously, so much learning in cEDH is trial and error, but Control is even more so because not only do you have to worry actively about your own game plan and executing your own game plan, you constantly have to be worrying about interrupting and stopping the other people's game plans completely and totally because you're 3 turns behind them when you're winning the game. So if you have no clue how one person's going to try to win the game, then you're not going to be able to know how to stop them effectively. Obviously.
So there is a degree of trial and error, but I know that seeing commanders, there is a certain degree of tells that comes with it. When I see a Thrasios File Smasher at the table, I know what strategy they're going for. I see a Godo player at the table, I know what strategy they're going for. And so those are a little bit more telegraphed. What do you do in the situations where it's not as telegraphed? If it's a Tymna Thrasios, maybe it's a Kenrith, is there something that you can do in those particular instances to maybe hedge your bets? Because, trial and error can get you so far, but if you're maybe in a league or you're going against a lot of blind metas, that's only going to get you to a certain point. Is there anything that you use to help kind of mitigate some of that learning curve?
I think at that point is where a lot of not meta, but cEDH format in general, meta knowledge and book knowledge about the format can really, help you take it to the next level. Obviously, you can't trial and error through everything. Like you said, somebody could bring their blue farm brew and suddenly you're in, you have no clue what they're doing. What's Bruce Tarl doing in my cEDH game?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that is the point where you have to put 2 and 2 together. I know that they are this color and this color, therefore they are probably going to try to cast Brain Freeze at an arbitrarily high storm count so they can cast their Underworld Breach and fuel it to a win, right? Counter the Underworld Breach, they can't do anything, right? Regardless of what the rest of their plan is. If you can learn a lot of common win lines to stop, if you can easily identify a lot of common value engines that you might want to try to shut down, that's a lot of the base level stuff is a lot of book knowledge and a lot of street smarts combining into one complete control player.
So I would definitely say that there are certain choreographs or tells that come from just the general cEDH meta as a whole. It doesn't take long before you realize that certain strategies play out in a very similar way. So while you might see Jessica Ishai or Kenrith or something like that, you can start to see when they choreograph an Underworld Breach combo. And so you don't always have to just see a commander to say, okay, I can see that they're doing a lot of graveyard-based things. I know that, I should probably expect some sort of Underworld Breach stuff coming from them. Sometimes the colors can choreograph that. Jeskai, it's one of its biggest strategies is Underworld Breach, unless it's something specific like Elsha. It's one of the strongest things it can do, so it does lean itself into that. Whereas, other things like the First Sliver, lends itself, they have Underworld Breach builds out there. But, for the most part, when I see the First Sliver, I'm thinking food chain. So it's kind of what the mainstay, if you will, of the first sliver is. But those choreographs, you start to see those types of things going on as the game plays out, and you can always pivot your strategy accordingly. I know as a proactive player, I have a certain role that I have at the table that I play. I want to be the person that, they want to try to stop, for lack of a better word. I want to race the table, or I want to find a way to get there before other people can either stabilize, build their value engines, or combo off before me. That all being said, what can you say about the role at a control player's table, other than, of course, that they're playing control?
For sure.
What goes into knowing a role at the table?
Yeah, like I said, so much of playing control is a lot of generalized cEDH stuff turned up to 11. A lot of times, no matter what you're playing, you got to play to your role at the table. Both, I'm playing this deck, and also I am this spot in the turn order. Some decks certainly care about that less than others, but I would generally say that control decks care about turn order the most. Because when you're playing control, you are 100% in a battle of resources. You have more mana than me, so you have more mana to play counter spells if we get into a counter war. You have more cards than me because, I don't know, you've drawn one more card for a turn than I have, all other things discounted. If people are ahead of you or behind of you, in the turn order, it gives you a massive change in how you have to think about interacting with that person. Because since it's a battle of resources, just by the nature of their spot in the table, you will automatically, in the average game, have more or less resources than these people. So maybe, it's not as huge of a deal if you're player 2. It's not as big of a deal if player 4 has something than it is if player 1 has something in a vacuum, right? And so you can use that knowledge to your advantage.
So at what point would a control player's role pivot? Would it ever pivot? Is it always going to be control? And the reason that I ask that is because there are times when a proactive player, if they're in fourth position, will affect their plays. They might even take a somewhat of a pseudo control stance against certain other people in their pod. Is that something that control will ever do, or is it always take a control stance no matter what? Talk to me a little bit about that.
I think that goes back a little bit to some of the deck building stuff, right? I think there are some control decks, specifically some of the more modern builds of Tasigur, that probably could rotate into a little more like value engine-y, mid-rangey. If they're in that first or maybe even second player spot, but certainly if they're in that first player spot, they can go, I am so comfortably ahead of especially like player 3 and 4 on resources that maybe I can go for a really fast combo win here should the opportunity present itself. But I think control in a lot more, compared to a lot of the other archetypes, is a lot more set into its main plans than a lot of other decks, just by the way that the deck is constructed. So unless you're a very specific kind of deck, off the top of my head, like I said, pretty much only modern Tasigur builds come to my mind as something that might change up the plan significantly based on, where they're sitting.
So it does sound like control is a little bit more locked in to something versus, let's say, more of a proactive or adaptive style. And that breeds a certain degree of rigidity in there. What are some ways that control can break out of that mold in a way that can help it?
Yeah, so honestly, one way you can break out of this rigidity oftentimes is make the table work for you. This is a competitive version of a very social format. There are 4 of us sitting here at the table. Obviously, politics are always going to play into this. Table talk is welcome, and it is almost certainly always underutilized by players all the time. And one of the greatest things that control players can do, both honestly, I think you should always be honest at a table, but you can also certainly use this to your advantage. When you sit down and you are playing control, especially people who are used to playing proactive, will expect you to always police the rest of the table for them. So even if they're a more mid-rangey list, I sit down, I've got a Malcolm Tana player to my right, someone who can combo really fast or, take the middle road, remove a few things, counter a few things, and they see that I'm playing Rashmi, they go, oh yeah, I can go to 5 to combo people out on turn 3, no problem. I don't have to worry about player 3 comboing off because the Rashmi player's got me. No, you need to instill in people that no matter what, you are not going to have all the answers. You only have 40 instants in your deck. You don't have 100 of them. Ideally, your deck could be only answers, but that's just not the case. So you have to communicate this to your opponents effectively, both for your own benefit and for their own. And in the way you're playing, make sure that they know that, wait for priority to come to you. Don't immediately say, oh yeah, mini frame, boom. Every single time someone plays something remotely threatening. Don't always counter everything because you don't have to. This is where some of threat assessment can come into play with politics. If you aren't that worried about someone having a heuristic study, then maybe you can project that, whoops, I'm out of answers over here. I guess the heuristic study resolves. But the next turn, when someone tries to combo off, you've got the miscast for them, right? You can save your answers through effective politicking. I think that's one major way you can break out of the mold that so many people view command players as, control players as. Let the rest of the table do your work for you through politics.
I know that's still very abstract, and those who are not used to it in those particular aspects, that can be very hard to actually translate into concrete terms. Can you give some specific examples besides just the heuristic study into miscast, because that was a good one? What are some other examples of how you can make sure, number one, that the table knows that you just can't answer everything, and 2, how you can make sure you can lean on them for the extra parts without being treacherous or dishonest?
Yeah, first off, I think being treacherous and dishonest is usually just not a good way to go while playing cEDH because, often we're just here to have a good fun. And obviously we're all spiky about it, but especially if you have, whether you're playing with randoms or with the same people you play with every week, there's no reason to be that way. But when you're playing control, there can really be a temptation to be that way. And so I think it's really important to just always be really straight up with people when you are communicating. It isn't always going to be as concrete as, oh yeah, I can't counter that heuristic study because I only have this miscast in my hand. But say to people, no, I can't counter that. Or, I pass priority on this one because I can't counter everything. It can even be that simple. That is a line that I use. If someone who I know has revealed a counterspell passes the priority to me, I will say, okay, they get a heuristic study because I can't counter everything in this game. You have to pull your weight as well because I know you have that. And stuff like that. I think just being blatantly honest with people about those kind of things will go a really far way towards making the rest of the table play for you. I keep using that phrase.
I definitely know that when I see a control player at the table, my instinct is to always, number one, know that they're the thing that's going to answer my threat. And number 2, that they're going to be the one to answer everyone else's threats. And I think that's what a lot of people bring into a game. When they see something like 4-color control or Rashmi or whatever, they say, oh, that's the guy I need to worry about when it comes to priority. That's the person, the man or the woman who might actually counter my strategy. And so I'm going to keep a close eye on them. But if you take the role or if you make sure you communicate as a control player, you're going to get less of that view or stigma as they sit down to the table. and making sure that communication is clear, but like I said, honest at the same time is really going to go in spades. I like what you said when you said, I'm going to look at my hand and I'm going to tell everyone that I can't counter this Rhystic Study because you have a miscast, right?
Yeah.
So you're like, sorry, I can't counter this Rhystic Study. If you want it gone, you got to answer it. Because it's true, you had a miscast in your hand. That says it doesn't mean you can't answer anything.
Yeah,
you were very specific in your words.
I cannot answer this Rhystic Study.
Yeah, I cannot answer this Rhystic Study, and also communicating, I can't answer everything. I like that. I like that's a wording that you use because it does let the other player know, look, you're going to have to answer some stuff too. You will end up losing if you think I'm the only one who can answer things.
Yep.
So
like
it's very interesting.
We're all playing blue here 90% of the time if Godo isn't in the pod.
True. Yep.
We're all playing blue here. I know you have X amount of counter spells in your deck. They have more uses than protecting your own win, okay? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
But I think this kind of gets a little bit into some of the dangers of piloting control in cEDH. We touched on it a little bit at the very top, but I want to roll back around into it. More than any other archetype, in between what your opponents are doing, in between what you rip off the top of your deck, in between what you get to do with your resources, I think more than any other archetype, the control demands for everything to go right. You really need to stick that wave break hippocamp because otherwise there is no way you are going to be able to keep up on cards to efficiently interact with everyone. You have to outlast your opponents and have to run them out of gas. Because especially when there's so many proactive decks running around these days, they will run out of gas. But a lot of them have they have big gas tanks that you got to run them out of before you get there. And then once you've run them out of gas, you'll have time to find your combo and execute it. But more than any other archetype in cEDH, I really do think that control decks demand more than anything else for things to go right, whether that be you communicating effectively, because if you fail at communicating your role to others effectively, then they'll rely on you and they'll let someone else win, right? And that's something that went wrong that you might have been able to mitigate.
Whenever I think of cEDH, I try to think about it in parallels. It helps give me additional perspectives when it comes to the game. A lot of times, I try to think about it in the realm of areas that I'm familiar with. One of them I've spoken about in the past is fighting games. Another one that I try to associate to certain degrees is things like boxing, mixed martial arts, and so on and so forth. These types of one-on-one matches, you have different divisions where they have different weight classes. And long story short, in the heavyweight classes, they hope to knock you out before they run out of gas. They have a very heavy swing. They can try and knock you out before, they have a chance to let the match go to all the way to time. And a lot of times there are certain strategies that different fighters will employ that goes into making that person run out of gas. The resilience and the ability to defend and the ability to stop. And when they get to the point where they've burned all their energy throwing these haymakers, trying to knock you out in one punch, because they're putting all of their force behind it, because that's how they can knock you out. But when they've tried that 5, 10, 12 times, their energy gets sapped from trying to throw it all behind the punch. And then the other person who has been defending this entire time still has enough gas in their tank, to use the same quotation, to be able to then take over the game. Would you say that that's kind of a parallel to something like control in cEDH?
Oh, yeah, sure. Continuing boxing as an analogy here a little bit, control is Floyd Mayweather.
Okay, now. All right.
No, I don't mean. I mean exactly. Okay, Floyd Mayweather of the last 5 years. He is concerned with only playing the most excellent defense possible, so you can technically win in the end.
That's right. I mean, we're not telling everybody to go out and start watching boxing or to get up to speed on Floyd Mayweather or anything like that. But basically, what he does is nothing the first 5 rounds.
Yep.
That's basically what the man does.
Yep.
He does absolutely nothing but wear you down for the first 5 rounds of the game, of the match. And then he starts to chip away at you.
Yep.
And that's kind of what I'm, kind of extrapolating from this conversation that we're having, is that if you take this approach going into the game of, I've got my gloves up, I'm blocking your attacks, and I'm wearing you down till you're running out of gas, then you have the ability to execute your combo and win the game, right?
Yeah.
But there is dangers involved with that, because somebody can just ring your bell. They can knock you out if you're not careful.
And that's especially kind of the thing going back to deck construction. When you're running so many of these interactive spells, sometimes you do just have the wrong counter spell at the wrong time. Sometimes you countered the wrong spell earlier in the turn cycle, and that lets someone pull off the win. And it's all of these kind of little minute decisions at every single level of the game that can end up to a win or a loss for a control deck, which is kind of intense.
When it comes to somebody who's thinking about moving from control in a 1v1 format to control in a 4-player format, what are some tips and advice you would give somebody like that?
So just like in a 1v1 format, one of the most valuable things that you can have is meta knowledge. When you're playing blue-white control in Modern, you really got to know what everyone else is going to try to do so that you can most effectively stop them. Here's the problem, though. Like Ian said a few weeks ago, cEDH very well might be the most mentally complex format that could possibly exist. You don't have one opponent to worry about. You have 3 opponents to worry about. You don't have their 75 cards to worry about. You have your opponent's 300 cards to worry about. There is so much more going on that you have to think about. So you have to be pretty well versed in overall meta knowledge, I think, to be successful, which is always the case with control, but it's cranked up to 11 in cEDH, so be prepared for that. And the other major thing I'd tell them to really watch out for is, again, the politicking thing. Obviously, in 1v1, that is something you do not have to worry about at all, beyond being, a generally nice person and not being rude to your opponent, right? So, be open about with other players about what you think is going on, what you should be worried about with your opponents. Pay attention to what they're doing. Communicate effectively that you can't answer everything like you magically can when you're playing a 1v1 game, right? Those are like the 2 major things that I'd advise coming over. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. A big thanks to our sponsors, TCG Player, Dragon Shield, and obviously support from viewers and listeners like you over at Patreon. If you would like to support us through any of those ways, we've got links in the description.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone supporting us and supporting us through those links as well. And with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap it up, just as Callahan said. So tune in next time when we talk about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we will see you next time. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this episode of the podcast. So tune in next time when we
Duke it out
to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table.
Duke it out.
Of course.